It's 7:02 PM, and I'm calling the June 27th, 2023
Recording in progress.
Planning Board meeting to order. This meeting is being recorded. Our first order of business, as usual, is to take roll call. So when I call your name, would you please indicate that you're present? Pat Norton,
Present.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, present.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Wheaton, present.
Emil Dahlquist,
Emil Dahlquist, present.
Beth Herr,
Present.
Rick Mitchell,
Present.
Matt Hamill, I don't know if he's here via Zoom.
Doesn't appear to be.
Doesn't appear to be present. And Marnie Crouch, present. So we're here today to discuss the draft overlay district that has been prepared. I want to emphasize that the draft overlay district is just that. It is very much a draft. It is by no means in final form. Having not reviewed it for a couple of weeks because I was on vacation, I reviewed it today, and I noticed that it does have some deficiencies that will have to be addressed, and of course that's typical of a document like this. It needs quite a bit of work to be as clear and concise as possible, and right now it is neither crystal clear or as concise as it could be. And so these are issues that we will have to address among ourselves. There's also very much a need to clarify the difference between a developer electing to utilize what we've termed illustrative plans or developers who elect to produce their own plans untethered to any of the illustrative plans that Jonathan and Emil have prepared. So having said that, the draft that's on the table right now does not contain sufficient clarity with respect to how the development standards and the subsidiary dimensional standards would apply to the illustrative plans, which are essentially form-based, and how they would apply to a concept plan that an independent developer would produce. So that's an area of this draft overlay district that needs some considerable work. And it's been brought to my attention, and in fact, Rick made a comment, there doesn't appear to be too much difference between the two levels of special permitting that are set forth in this draft overlay district. So the one form of special permitting that would apply to the illustrative plans.
Oh, they can't hear you. I don't think they can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies.
Get it closer.
So with the use of the illustrative plans, those plans would be deemed to have satisfied certain provisions of the bylaw, and the concept plans would not. And again, there's been a bit of pushback about the amount of as-of-right development that we've allowed in this bylaw, and I believe the seminary is pushing for considerably more as-of-right development, and the planning board has not really endorsed a significant amount of as-of-right development for obvious reasons. And as-of-right development, in some respects, is not particularly predictable. And I think we're all aware of the 9 lots on Bridge Street. They are examples of as-of-right development. And as-of-right development does not always yield great results. There can be problems associated with it. And as-of-right development doesn't have much of a leverage for the planning board. It is as of right. We can couple it with site plan review, but essentially we are very much limited in whether or not we could deny a proposal that's predicated on an as of right concept. So That's the reason that there's not a lot of as-of-right development that's set forth in this draft overlay district. Right now, as-of-right development pertains to the reuse of the existing dormitory buildings. So with that said, I would invite any comments from other board members. I note that the seminary is of the belief that the planning board is, in its words, at an inflection point, and I would have to agree with that, because right now this draft overlay district is an attempt to appeal to all constituencies, and it may be that it will appeal to no constituencies. The abutters have one agenda, the seminary has another agenda, the select board is focused on fiscal developments, and the planning board is engaged in planning, and that's what planning boards are supposed to do. Planning boards have to be more than just permitting boards. I mean, we have to look to the future. We have to embrace new ideas, and some of those ideas which may be new to the town are in fact not new. So form-based code is not a new concept. It's used widely in New England, and AML has made many attempts to educate not just the planning board, but the select board and the general public about the benefits of form-based coding. But that's a lesson that is maybe difficult to understand and appreciate, because the complexities associated with it are all up front, and the benefits are something that emerges once a developer elects to use them. So with that introductory remarks, I'd like to invite some comments from other board members about this draft and how it can be improved. So maybe we could start with you, Rick, and just go around the table.
Marnie, is there a way, the noise here, we cannot hear a word.
Yeah, we can turn that off.
It's so bad.
Yeah, it's loud for us up here too, so I think we should turn it off.
How do we do that?
There's a control behind the screen that we're gonna have to raise the screen to get to the control. Pat? It is. Wait until we raise the screen. The secret,
Okay.
There's a safe behind that.
That's the payoff. We'll be all done with this, we just get to the cash.
There it is. Well done.
My apologies. My voice apparently doesn't carry too far.
I heard everything, but it was a strain.
Okay. Is this better? Is this?
So much better without that. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Rick?
so, you're right, we're at an inflection point. And the board has put a lot of time and effort, especially Jonathan and Emil, into developing the form and format of this bylaw. And while we've had general comments from the seminary, we really haven't had any specific comments on this draft. And I understand from talking to the chair of the Board of Selectmen that the seminary has been requested to do a red line review and comment on every section within the bylaw, proposed bylaw.
Yes, Ken Barnes from the seminary. Yes, what we are doing in order to assist this very process is going through the draft bylaw, and we wanted to give the planning board time to to solidify the draft. I think we're all pretty clear that it may not be final, but it's taken considerable form. And we'll go through it, and we'll come back to you with very specific comments. And we want to do that, frankly, to respect all the hard work that's gone into it. And so we're looking forward to sending that to you. You'll have it in plenty of time for the July 11th meeting.
Right, and I appreciate that, but with a note of caution is that I'm very much hopeful that the draft that's on the table now will be different before July 11th. So you may be responding to something that is a work in progress. So as you note from my preliminary remarks, my own personal review, I see deficiencies in it. So I want to address those deficiencies, and I'm sure those are things that you will note as well.
Well, this is the catch-22. On the one hand, we don't want people to say, how come the seminary hasn't given us any details? And then we get the comment, well, it's still a work in progress. So at some point, you have to say, I think it's probably close enough that we can make some comments. And I want to reiterate the fact that we are happy to get in a room with a few people and talk about some of these things so that we don't work in silos. But in the meantime, we are looking forward to being as specific as we can be, and we really appreciate all the work.
Well, Dr. Barnes, I'll say this, that at our next meeting, I believe it's July 11th, that we will be listening to your views primarily. We had 2 sessions that we heard a lot from the abutters, and they're welcome, obviously, on July 11th, and they'll be welcome to speak as well. But we want to speak to you particularly on July 11th. And in this regard, I do note that in this draft bylaw, we provide what we have denominated SP1, and that's really a special permit light, or an abbreviated special permitting process. And it occurs to me, and I don't know how other planning board members feel about this, that we might want to have, as of right, reuse of the existing buildings on the upper campus, subject to site plan review, as something that's consistent with the reuse of the dormitory buildings. So that is one change that I would be interested to hear from other board members, but it's one that I would consider. And so that's one piece that might be altered somewhat.
Well, that
So-
wasn't lost on us in the handout or in the attachment that was sent around the other day. We noticed that reuse of existing buildings on the Hill is one of the things that is potentially, and we've always said we thought it makes sense. On the handout, it says existing office, business space. We would say that the medical services, et cetera, the outpatient stuff should probably go in there as well. I had someone on campus yesterday, a local resident, elderly gentleman, and he said he hates having to go to Beverly to see his doctor, and they're pretty much chock-a-block. So I think there are a lot of things that we could agree on that would be good for the community and make best use of those buildings.
Well, I will say this, that, and I don't know if it's something that you recall, and I believe John Witten's on the line, so he can, on Zoom call, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but only those uses that are set forth in this draft overlay district are permitted. If a use is not set forth in this draft overlay district, it's prohibited. So we don't really have to worry about prohibited uses. We just want to make sure we identify the uses that are in fact permitted.
Exactly. And as I said, the question then becomes, which ones are by right because you're not changing the shell of the building, and which ones are by various levels of special permit. We understand that.
So it's really reuse of the existing buildings is not dependent necessarily on how they would be, what that use would be. So it could be a medical office or a whatever.
Yeah, and that would just have to be clarified on this, because at this point, they appear to be separated.
Well, I raised that as one idea, but I would defer to the other planning board members to voice their sentiments on that. So
Great.
it's one thing that I considered, but I can't speak right at the moment for everyone else.
Yeah.
So,
I continue?
oh, absolutely.
Did that answer your question, Rick?
It does, but I have another request as well, and maybe it will be reflected in the comments that I hope are very specific. rather than general, because I think that's part of the problem. Typically, when a developer comes to us, they have a plan. The seminary has been opaque at best as to what it actually is going to do with the campus. I found it a little bit surprising that I read in the Salem Evening News 2 weeks ago that the seminary announced that it had abandoned its quest to find space in Boston. So I find it's difficult to formulate policy and recommendations when we have no clue what the seminary's plans are. Now, I understand it's fluid, but we still have no idea what, when, and where the seminary might want to retain any ownership, which throws everything in that we're doing into question. And it makes it really difficult to formulate. It's already a difficult problem if we're looking at a market and saying, what's the market potential here, when the owner is silent on its potential uses of that property, and what a commercial broker is recommending to it as potential uses on that. So I'd like the seminary to be much more forthcoming in terms of what it sees as its future and its potential development there.
Well, at the last 2 public meetings in the library, I said publicly that the probability is we will stay on part of the campus because we had abandoned our plans to go to Boston. What we said was, we are putting the entire campus up for sale. The market will tell us what is the most valued part of that property, and that will guide our thinking. That's certainly our right as the landowners. We would like to stay. We love being here. We would love to be the neighbors of any new developers, but we need to right-size the operation. So I don't think it's opaque to say that we're in a situation where we have had disruption in our sector, the likes of which no one has ever seen. Just today, there was an announcement of another small but well-established college similar to ours, which is going to close. It's the nature of the beast. We are very fortunate that we have this asset, that we are willing to work with the town to figure out how best to put to use for the community, for the taxpayers, and to allow us to right-size. So I wish I could say to you, oh, Rick, we're going to stay on the hill and everything else will be sold to a developer. Or we're going to sell the hill and sell the apartments and we're going to keep the middle part of it. I can't tell you that because until the market comes back to us, and the property went on the market today, until the market comes to us and says, we're interested in that, we're interested in this, we can't tell you that. But I would say the probability is, and that's not opaque, that's just the reality, the probability is we will retain a considerable portion of that campus in order for us to continue the 50-year mission of the seminary. That hasn't changed. So that's the situation. That's why, obviously, we're hoping for as much flexibility as possible in the zoning, because that makes it more attractive to potential buyers. It makes it easy for us to figure out where to go and where to stay. But if someone came along tomorrow, Rick, with a great big check and said, we want the whole thing, then we would have to think about that. But the probability is we will not go into Boston because we did an extensive study of property in Boston and found that the economics didn't work.
What, could I interject at this point? Because
The problem with that approach is it means the likelihood is that the hill will be developed in a piecemeal manner. So somebody will come along and want to do the top, and you'll say, oh, yes, we'll do the top. And then the question is, once the top is done that way, will somebody still want to do the bottom and the middle? And so when you don't put it up for wholesale, when you say, all right, this is the most profitable use for here, so we'll take that for now, and 5 years from now, we'll put this back on the market, then it's going to be developed in a piecemeal way.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily true, Bill.
It's not necessarily true,
Yeah.
but it's
But-
likely.
but
the market,
again-
the market will do that.
Quite possibly. And again, the whole property is up for sale. But none of us in this room knows what is going to go there. So that's why we've been working with the planning board, with the select board, to try to figure out how can we bring safeguards to bear so that whatever happens, whether it's one new owner or 3 new owners, whatever happens there is going to make sense for the property, for the owners, for the town.
Okay, at this point, though, I have to raise the idea because we are grappling, and I've said it before, with so many different contingencies. It's three-dimensional chess. So one idea is to just wait until you have a buyer, until you have a developer with a plan. And then we would have a professional who could come into the planning board, and then the planning board could address concrete proposals instead of hypotheticals. Because we're dealing now with a plethora of hypotheticals instead of one concrete development. Does that make more sense? Because the planning board, and particularly, as we've noted, Jonathan and Emil, but I will put myself out there too, because I drafted this overlay district with the input that needs to come from them. We're working really hard, and it may be in the end, the seminary will not appreciate our efforts and go forward rejecting the overlay district and refusing to enter into a development agreement, and we'll be left wondering what this was all about. So that is, I think,
It would
a
be
legitimate
a real
question
shame if
to raise.
if we expended a lot of political capital and got this approved, and then we put it out to market, and you found that there was interest in only one part of the property. So, you know, you stay on the other 2/3, and one piece of the property is sold, and the townspeople are left saying, well, what was all that hubbub about? You know, 3/4 of you are, 3/4 of the seminary is going to remain there.
If I may remind the board, we did not start this process. We were invited to participate
You
in
were
this
invited by
process.
the select board to do that. So I'm just saying, regardless, I mean, you keep saying that you were invited to do that, but is it not to your benefit to have this overlay district? I mean, regardless of whether the select board initiated this process or not. But the bottom line is the task is falling to the planning board. And we have to do our job independent of the select board and respectfully independent of you, because we are the planners. We are looking to the future, and we are looking to all constituencies, and we are mindful that in the last analysis, we can please the select board, we can please the seminary, but the citizens of Hamilton might not be pleased at all, and they will reject the entire endeavor.
Madam Chair, I have no response to that other than to say, again, we did not initiate this process. We were invited to participate in this process, and we are doing our best to work with the planning board so that the desired result, instead of nobody being happy, everybody's happy, because something very reasonable and very respectful of everyone's interests, as I said, is a win-win. So that's what we're looking for. That's what we're hoping for.
So what would you, why would you object if the planning board took the, position that we've done a lot of work, we think there are all sorts of possibilities, but we're not going to, put a plan before the town until you bring us a developer who has a plan? We'll work with that developer. Presumably it'll come out looking something like this, but why do we go through all this work without a developer? And then, you can put it out there and sell it, and we'll work with the developer.
I can't respond to that because it's not my process.
Well,
we will.
hold on a second. It is your process. You are the key player. You're the only reason we are here. I engaged with you and the president a year ago and said, we need to figure out a comprehensive plan for the highest and best use of that property that benefits the town, the abutters, and the seminary. So you have been intimately involved in this process. And Ken, with all due respect, you are the property owner. You've had a year. We hired a consultant did a detailed analysis, showed what the most likely economic uses would be on that property. You've got now a commercial broker who's looking at the property, who should be able to tell you within a few hours of looking at that property what the potential uses are. And I'm getting a little frustrated and impatient with the lack of clarity, with the lack of honesty about what you are intending to do with that property. You keep falling back and says, I don't know, whatever the market says. Well, great, if that's what you want to do, then we're going to wait for you to come with a proposal. We've already identified that an overlay district could generate probably about $50 million in new revenue to the Gordon Theological Seminary, as opposed to about $4 million if you sold it under the existing zoning. So I don't know why this is so hard for the seminary to become more concrete and say, listen, this is what we think the uses are, this is what we want to do there. We see value in what our consultant that we paid $90,000 to do an analysis of the financial and economic and land use options that very clearly articulated what they are so that you could make an intelligent, informed decision. And we're getting Jell-O. You know, and I understand you're trying to figure out what your future looks like, but we need clarity and definition, and that helps us put this together. And we're just not getting it. So I don't know how we get there.
May I offer a thought? So the planning board doesn't need to know the exact disposition of the property in the future. The planning board doesn't need to know exactly what's going to be purchased or how it will be purchased. But what would be very useful to the planning board is right now there's too many variables. So if the seminary was able to build a couple scenarios, like we've built lots of scenarios. We've got, different plans, different layouts, different uses, scenarios. We don't know which one will play out, but we've got, we've narrowed it down to a few scenarios. If the seminary could do the same thing and start to just narrow down, okay, if this sold, we would use this in this way. If that sold, we would use that in that way. Just start to create some kind of you must know realistically what will serve your organization, in terms of what parts and pieces, and you must have some idea of more or less what proportion you'd like to hang on to. So we don't need you to predict the future, but what we need to do is narrow down the options. Is that a reasonable characterization of this, our board members?
I'd like to comment as well on this. We've been operating pretty much, I'll say, in a vacuum. Again, no disrespect here. What you do and what you say is what you do and what you say. In the absence of any clarity in terms of what you actually want there, has prompted us to be proactive in this, to say, okay, well then what would the town like to see on this site? And why don't we write a code that way, and then use the code as incentive for a developer to come in and have a smoother path to an approval based on this plan. So we created our own, and the comments that came out in the Salem News, from my standpoint, didn't really impact anything. We knew you were going to stay. We didn't know how much of the site would be occupied by Gordon Conwell. That's fine. I don't think we need to know that. The problem we have is that this can get shot down by you, can get shot down by the town, and unless we have the support of the theological seminary and work to make a project that is suitable for the town, that the town can actually vote for, we have a big problem, because there are so many people who can reject this project right now. We're operating in a very kind of tenuous position, trying to create something that's satisfied. We're trying to explain it, why it's being done that way, why it's important to do it that way, but also knowing that come November, whatever, or even sooner, if you find a buyer for the site, the project is gone, and all this work that's going into that is for naught. And that's the problem. And that's why the thought is, well, why aren't we talking with the developer on this? You, in a sense, I guess, are the broker on this. You're going to sell it to somebody, you sell the property rights to once you get a rezone, redistricted. But that is the problem, from my perspective, that we have. We're happy to operate and do this project, but we just know that at some point, the seminary is going to say no to us or sell the property, and it's gone. And we have no assurance that this is going to go through. And I thought, as part of the partnership, that would have been solidified in some way to give us a time frame that you wouldn't sell until we produce a code, and then, and also get to know what your hard demands are. What would prompt the seminary to say, no, we can't accept that at all? Because we don't really know on that. What we hear is we want something very simple. What we hear is flexibility. What we hear are all the things that allow you to have all that freedom to wait and see what happens. Wait for a developer to come forward with an idea, because the developers have the ideas. That's what we're being asked to do. And in the meantime, we have a clock ticking where we know we have to produce something by a deadline, not getting a lot of cooperation, frankly. And you have been attending every single meeting. You do make responses, and I appreciate all of that. The problem, though, is that we are operating without what, as Jonathan was saying, what the final variables are going to be that could really control whether this project works or doesn't work. And
Well, like I
And
said.
could I just add to what Emil said, though? Because of that, this draft overlay district that's on the table is extraordinarily complex. It's ridiculously
You think?
complex. We're trying to respond to Abramson and Associates, and it could not have been more clear what Abramson recommended for that site. He said residential development was likely. So Jonathan and Emil have really pinpointed that as the most probable. And the commercial uses, the biotech, and all these other, pie in the sky, in my view, are user-driven. So does this mean that this property will be held on the market for 5 years and then something will happen? So we're trying to do all this rigmarole with hypothetical scenarios. Form-based code, because a developer can come in and they will know that if they build to those illustrative plans, they're going to sail through. It's going to be great. And it'll be wonderful for the site, because when you look at what Jonathan and Emil have produced and what the residential neighborhoods would look like, they would be remarkable, and they would be so forward-thinking, and they would be models for other development in the town. But we're also providing another option. Nobody's bound to that form-based code. And so, to have the trickle down of all the dimensional standards and the design standards for those two options, it's hard to write.
Here's a thought. Why don't we take a version of this, and you give it to your commercial broker, and you say to the broker, we have a really accommodative planning board here. They're spending all sorts of effort trying to think of what to do with this. They came up with a draft of a plan for the Hill that has all these flexible options, okay? But the town doesn't want to pass that as a bylaw until they have a willing buyer standing in front of them, or a developer who, in fact, will work with them and consummate the deal. But you can see, Mr. Commercial Broker, from all the flexibility and everything else that's been built into this, that the town is really being very accommodative and thinking about a wide range of options. So the broker has something to show prospective buyers that the town is serious, and the town is, willing to allow quite a lot of flexibility on this hill. But it seems really almost superfluous for the planning board to put all this effort in and to try and get it through the town meeting when there's no buyer and no, firm plan for it that's acceptable. So you and the buyer can, negotiate to us, but you have to bring a buyer. I wouldn't mind having this, a version of this shown around the commercial brokerage industry. No, this is the kind of thing the planning board. This is the kind of thing the town is thinking of.
Well, this is public information. It's out
Right.
there.
So
You've seen it.
I'm not sure, have they?
Sure.
Oh,
of
yeah, it's
course.
public information.
Of course they have.
I
We've
know
shared
they
it.
can
We've
see
shared it because we are willing
website.
participants in this
It's on our
process.
Our website, then just point them to that
We,
and
they've
say,
seen
and
it.
say, bring a buyer, bring some buyers, maybe more than one. Somebody that wants to do residential here, somebody that wants to do commercial there. Have them, come before the planning board with their plans for this part of the hill and that part of the hill. And then we'll craft the final, bylaw that we put before the town. And we will have buyers ready to act on that plan, rather than trying to do everything in advance.
Well, the other benefit to that, and I know in your letter of June 5th, you referred to this, but we cannot ignore the septic, the erosion control, the traffic, and all these other things. They are not per se part of the zoning, but any professional developer that comes in would understand that they have to address all these issues. We can't just assume that we'll approve a project and we don't have to worry about the septic or the traffic or anything else. Well, of course we do, because if they're not addressed in a logical way and there are requirements that a developer address these things, then the proposed overlay district will go down in flames at town meeting, because of course everybody in town wants to know, will I be affected by this? Will there be a problem? Obviously, the planning board doesn't oversee the septic system, but we have to know that a developer is doing the right thing to get that issue addressed in an appropriate and professional way. We can't just say, oh, it'll be fine. As of right, it'll be fine, no problem. We can't, it would be irresponsible to just assume everything goes according to plan when we all know it seldom does.
I like Bill's idea, because they have something to react to and say, this either is workable given the market that they know about and they can represent, or it's not, and it needs to change in X, Y, and Z manner. Because I think we are at an inflection point, and I just don't feel comfortable investing more time and energy on putting together this 3D puzzle, not knowing what the landowner has in mind. And it's not unusual that a broker actually would come in and, I would welcome somebody to come in and say, listen, this, I don't want them to say this, but I would like the honesty to say, this isn't going to work. But here's
And
what.
what should we do instead?
Right.
Yeah, yes,
And-
absolutely.
And say, if you modify it in this certain sections, because we know the market and we have buyers that would be interested if it had these component pieces to it that protect the town and the abutters and provide maximum value to the seminary. And then we can sort of say, okay, let's work with that developer or commercial broker to formulate something that meets those criteria.
Well, let me just say that we have willingly participated in this process from day one. We accepted the invitation. We've done nothing but appreciate all the hard work that all of you have done. But we have begged on many occasions to have the opportunity to have exactly the kind of input you've just asked us to do. So I promise you, we will take up that opportunity and we will come back to you with what we think would make a really good bylaw.
Well,
How's that?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
I
good,
think-
but
I-
I
but
would-
I
we're
think
happy to
I
do
think
that.
it's more than that. I think it's really more than that. It's not what would make a good bylaw, but what are you going to do? I mean, you say, we'll stay at the top of the hill. Okay, and I get it. All right, you'll keep the library. But then you say, maybe we'll keep the bottom of the hill. And I go, okay, well, the dormitories, yeah, at $310 a month for a train pass to get into Boston, that works better than housing students in downtown Boston where rents are $3,000 a month. Okay, I get that. You could keep the dormitories, you could keep the library. I don't know where you'd go in the middle of the campus other than the retreat house, but, or Pilgrim Hall, but I leave that to you. But we need an idea of, and Rick said this, what are your plans? How do you see this all unfolding? And the other thing with respect to that, the planning board wants to see a cohesive, I think primarily residential development there with this senior housing, 55 plus, and/or, the residential senior housing like Riverbend on the site is something that's the most consistent with our rural suburban character. But what do you see? We want to see all the different components of the site fit together. How will that work with your scenarios? I mean, if you have a commercial development here, are you really going to get an upscale residential development somewhere else on the site? The site has to work together as a whole from the planning board's perspective. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would suggest, and if I were in your shoes, I would not only have the commercial broker, but I would engage a real estate lawyer who's actually been like a John Witten, but not John Witten, who's actually formulated and worked with developers to put together bylaws and work with towns, because I don't think that expertise exists at the Gordon Theological Seminary. I know you have a great deal of experience doing this, but we're talking about getting into the nitty-gritty of how to reuse this piece of property. And I'd love to have your commercial broker in here and give lots of, honest feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. Not that you're going to come back, again, I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I don't want you to say, yeah, we're going to come back with an honest feedback. I want concrete, reality, market-based feedback that says, this is what we think we're going to do with this property, given the market now. This is where we think we will stay, if we're going to stay. But if we get the maximum value from the uses that the commercial broker tells us, then we're gone. I want that commercial broker to bring his or her reality to the table and say, this is good, this is bad, this won't work, this is what's going to generate the best project for the seminary. I want you guys to come to the table and be ready to negotiate and say, with somebody that says, this is what the market is. I don't want more, and again, forgive me, I don't want more bromides or platitudes about we want to work with you. I want concrete things that we can deal with.
Very good.
I just wanted to say, when Jonathan was talking, it just made me think about, I think there's clear places in the seminary that are being underused. And obviously, those would be the places you would want to, I mean, for me, if I was doing it, I'd be like, looking at those dorms, since I think it's like 40 or 50% unoccupied. I'd be looking at the retreat house that's not being used and Pilgrim Hall. Like those, if I was to say in your place, that's just how my brain works. So, I mean, I think it's very clear, like when Jonathan was saying, like, let's look at what you would want to get rid of, or sell, or repurpose, or if you did sell the top of the hill, then where would you have your classes, or where would you, Anyway, I think that's kind of, for me, I kind of jumped off of what he was saying, but those are just some of the
I can
things.
assure you we've done all of those.
Okay.
But I have the battle scars to know that if you try to predict the market, you will get yourself into trouble. And so that's why we keep saying we have contingencies, and that's why we would like to see some flexibility so that we can be as agile and resilient as possible to whatever the market brings us. So that just makes sense. However, Jonathan, I like your scenarios idea. I think that does make sense. We, as I said, we have been, from our perspective, on the outside looking in for this whole process. That's probably not your perspective, but that's been our perspective. We've been on the outside looking in. We've attended every meeting. We've made the occasional statement at the end of a meeting and not much more. The purpose of the redlining exercise was to bring exactly the kind of detail that Rick is looking for. But I hear now that there's an invitation to go even further than just looking at your form-based approach. We will come back to you with something in addition to the form-based approach and say, in our ideal world, we would love to see this. we think it would generate this, it would do that for the town, it would allow us to operate, the abutters would be happy, et cetera. We're happy to do that, absolutely happy to do that. In fact, we relish the opportunity.
Good.
Well,
'cause
Dr. Barnes, as I've said before to you, Mass General Laws, Chapter 48, Section 5 authorizes you as a property owner to actually submit a proposed bylaw to the planning board. And at that point, the planning board then reviews it and makes a recommendation to the voters of whether to approve or disapprove it at town meeting.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's
But we've
certainly
viewed that
within-
as disrespectful until you've completed your work.
Right,
We
right.
wanted to let you complete your work.
Right, right.
We talked about that and said that would be incredibly disrespectful of you and the process and the select board and everybody else for us to say, we're just going to do our own thing. So we have tried very hard to be respectful of what you're doing and to give our input wherever we're able to. We will come back to you with our understanding of your approach, and then you can see an approach we might like to see, and then we have something to compare, and we can go from there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense to you, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I would advise, rather than spending time, and if you can do it, that's great, rather than on the red line version, because it could completely change with what your scenarios are, your preferred scenarios. So I think that would be more helpful than a red line, because as we said, you know, we're working on a model that we don't even know would be appropriate given what the seminary wants to do. And quite frankly, I wish you'd be more pushback. Don't worry about being disrespectful. We're used to dealing with developers who come in and are very definitive about what they want and how they want it to happen. That's how we can get some traction on this and get some productivity and concrete planning that works for all of us. So please, the more concrete, the more definition, and the more clarity, the better.
And the other thing, if I might add, I think I could probably find it, but I know that Emil did a presentation for a joint meeting of the Planning Board and the Master Plan Steering Committee about form-based codes. He also introduced that concept to the Select Board, but I think that the seminary may not really understand how that form-based approach can actually be very beneficial to developers. And Emil, perhaps you could articulate it better than me as to how developers view these form-based codes. And I think you would be a better spokesperson at this juncture than me about how the use of the form-based approach coupled with another option does provide the flexibility that you have repeatedly stated is the seminary's ideal scenario.
Well, for some of us from the beginning, this was a tool we wanted to create for the town going forward, not only at the Gordon Conwell site, but that the town could actually use, because there has to be planning in town going into the future. And this has been proven to be, in my opinion, an invaluable tool, especially when dealing with developers, because they like it. It will give the town a reputation of being pro-development in the right way. The town gets its say in what happens, so that the town can decide what to protect, what to maybe enhance a little bit, you know, what to trade off for something better, and those kinds of critical things. And it is a way that the town can really grow if it gets proactive, and that's the key here. We have to start thinking in advance, and that's why I thought that the form-based component of this, and it's a hybrid code more than a form-based code, but it's the component of that is to incentivize the developer coming in, because what they do is have a streamlined path to an approval, which is what all the developers want in the end. That's what they want. They want to build it and leave and so forth. But the town has a very strong interest in doing the right thing for the community. And I thought the planning board is taking the right position in terms of what it is looking at to do the best thing for the site. We understand, we've heard from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary what they would like to see sort of there. But I think what we see it from a slightly different perspective. I mean, I would look at it, anything better than a 1 acre zoning is good for you, is good for the property. And if the numbers that Rick quoted were correct, it's an extraordinary increase in the value of the land there. And that's fine. If both can get a win out of this. And I'm not sure what you say when you say win, what the win on your side actually is. It probably comes down to, you mentioned fiduciary responsibility, it comes down to making, I'm sure, as much money as possible on the site. That would be probably, I'm not trying to sound crude here, but that would be the ultimate goal there.
Within reason. Again, because we take our responsibility as good neighbors very seriously,
Well, that's why
including the fact that we may be one of those neighbors.
Yeah, right.
So,
Madam Chairman, may I suggest that we think about putting the schedule for this bylaw on hold and waiting to hear what, I mean, it's important to hear what the seminary would like to do with the site. In terms of bylaws, we know what they would like. They like the most flexibility possible. And then, and really wait until we have one or more developers, having seen this, who look at it and say, well, I might be able to work with the board on this and this. Then we work with them. Then we fine-tune this bylaw, and then we get it passed. As opposed to trying to pass something in advance that has all these options and possibilities, and we really don't know whether the market is going to like that or not. Let's find out what the market likes, and then we'll craft a bylaw that meets our collective goals.
I would second that.
So is that a formal motion, Bill?
For discussion.
Why don't we
discussion.
discuss a little bit? I think there's a lot of merit in that approach. I think that one has to be realistic about is if you pause where we are right now and then we shifted gears in response to some market influence or a specific developer or two, there would likely be a little bit of backwards movement in this process, and then you'd move forward. And I think that to do that, there needs to be a set of realistic expectations by the board, by the select board, and by the seminary, that can be done, but it can't be done overnight. That's all.
Yeah, it definitely would require a reset.
Yes.
There, you sat down.
I thought you were going to discuss your motion, I'm sorry.
And the other thing that would be helpful, because when we originally sat down and talked to you and Scott, was I asked, what's your time horizon for the property? And Scott said at the time, we expect to be off the property by 2024. So that is important information for us to know, because it provides the framework within which we need to work. Because again, we don't want to be slowing this up to the point where you go, well, we're out. We're done.
I'd like to offer one other thought on this, and this is going to be a less popular thought, and here it comes. So, right now, the board and the town has a unique opportunity here, in that the skills that are on this board currently allow the town to have a fairly in-depth set of skills at their beck and call for no cost. Those skills may not always be with the board, at which point, if the timing is such that this process is reset and you do this, the town and the seminary need to be able to conjure with the idea that there might be significant costs to craft this thing if the same skills are not on the board at that time. That's all. There may be some consulting costs.
Jonathan, are you foreshadowing?
I am foreshadowing. So. That's all.
Yeah, no, time is of the essence, and we're all, we're all willing and able and very passionate, as you've seen, about working to make this work for everybody. Can be a win-win, but we need engagement by everybody, and the abutters are certainly more than willing to engage. They've made that very clear, and thank you for being here, because you're an important component of making this work. And the planning board is all out, to the exclusion of other important zoning that the town could be doing, or other important planning activities. So we just want to work with you in a concrete fashion. So
We will have something for you by the 11th, guaranteed.
And Bill, I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't dispute it. I would like to take our existing draft and, to the extent possible, improve it to some extent so that so we incorporate the materials that Jonathan and Emil have done.
I totally understand it, and I think it's important for us to hear the seminary and maybe to revise it, but I don't think we should push it through the approval process.
Right.
Okay, so if we want to revise this, put a little more time in, that makes sense. But I don't think we should tell the town, we're giving you this bylaw and want you to approve it, even though we don't have any buyers. And it's a prospective, plan that we don't know whether it'll ever come to fruition. If I look at this as a town resident, I say, well, why don't we wait till there's a buyer and work with them? So it doesn't become a bylaw. We don't push it through that process until we have somebody to work with and we know it'll really work. But we can certainly fiddle with it. Make it better, make it,
well, I think we could work on some basic concepts and a sort of framework, but I don't want to get too far into the weeds until we get some feedback.
yeah.
Well, I think that the kind of the concern that I have is really this residential commercial split and how the two can meld together in one site. And I know it is possible, but I think.
But here's another example where
So but it goes to your
But,
point about drafting
if we
something.
just focus on the commercial issue, right? If a commercial broker comes in and says, well, we have 2 or 3 companies over here, and these people operate at about 900 square feet per person. So that means there's only going to be 200 cars a day. And you know what? They don't use much water at all. And, a bunch of other things. And you go, And then here's another buyer over here, and they operate at 300 square feet per person, so that's 900 cars every morning. And they're, use a lot of water, use a lot of power, do a bunch of other things. And, we have lots of these buyers, and we don't have many of these buyers. If we had some examples so that we would know, just how impactful that's going to be, because it will depend on the user.
Well, and even if there is a commercial buyer
Is there actually a buyer there? And
It's user driven and
that's right. Let's have some users before we
and that-
try and let's listen to a few examples of users who actually might turn into buyers before we try and craft a law for how we're going to or not going to accommodate them.
Well, and this is not unusual. We've done this in previous bylaws. When we've been drafting, we then bring in mostly residential, local people, and say, hey, take a look at this and tell us how you would react to this, and what are the, strengths and weaknesses of it. Because we were trying to get some real feedback, and I think that's what we're trying to do here is, how would this play in your world?
I mean, I think it's also true that the uncertainty that Ken refers to also has an effect here. If we say we're interested in, only commercial buyers who would generate a certain amount of traffic or wouldn't overload our water system or whatever, and they say, well, there's only 3 of those buyers on the East Coast and they're not coming up here, then we say, well, okay, why are we going through all of this trouble for that 1 in a million probability, as opposed to they say, oh yeah, we have lots of companies who want to move out from Cambridge. They all have these characteristics. Here's their environmental impact. It would really help to know who's out there before we try and, build a bylaw to accommodate them. Or who's interested.
So where do we go from here?
That's
That's the $10,000 question.
That's the $10,000 question. And so I think we should take, at least for now, a 2-track approach. I think we should improve our existing draft by incorporating Emil and Jonathan's latest work to the extent possible, and get this bylaw in a somewhat better format, because I think it would be even more useful to a commercial broker if it was a little more clear as to what the intent was. And perhaps John Whitten might help us with that. It would be great if he could, work with me to clarify these things and get the numbering and some of the other more stylistic issues in place. But then I think if a commercial broker or a potential developer saw it, they would have at least some sense of what the planning board was thinking and how flexible the planning board is. It may not be flexible as flexible as you may like in terms of as of right, but it's certainly flexible in terms of here's a form-based approach that if you follow this, it's going to be, you're good to go, pretty much. Or here's you come in with your own idea and then we will evaluate it depending on whether it's a reuse of an existing building or demolition of buildings in new construction. And you can see how that would be very much more impactful on the
And then we
butters and the
call it
town
a
itself.
proposed bylaw and park it until we get a few buyers to actually come in and look at it and make a proposal before us?
I think, along those lines, Marnie, a couple of things stand out, and this is not to push aside what Emil has suggested, but to my comments is the SP1 and SP2, I think that's what a potential buyer is going to look at, is what are the hurdles? SP2, probably pretty clear, because he could look at it and say this is going to be a rigorous process. SP1, I don't know. So that's a real strong signal as to where the board stands in terms of if it's a preferred use and there's clarity for that preferred use, a developer's going to look at it and, well, this is an easier path, less costly in time and money, and it's market, it conforms with the market demand, then this is where I want to go. So I would think, from my perspective, if I were a developer, I'd read all of this and I'd say illustrative plan, concept plan, great, but when I get to the decision-making criteria, what are they?
Right, right. And so that, I agree that could be more clear, but with the SP1,
And why, we want them in here telling us that.
We do, but we'd like to offer, I mean, you're right, we could wait and say, but I'd like to have, like Jonathan Whitten, because he's the one that brought in the concept from SP1 to SP10, what an SP1 looks like, so we have some base from which to make a decision, rather than a developer coming in, well, my SP1 is, well, it's about 2 lines long, as opposed to, well, what has an attorney that's gone through this many times and negotiated development agreements and worked with cities and towns, what has he seen worked in other communities?
So right now in the draft overlay district, the way the SP1 works is that if you follow the illustrative plans, then section 9.6.7.5, a reason to simplify the numbering, that would be deemed satisfied. And we should all recognize that section, because that's the equivalent of 8.1.12 that preoccupied us so much with respect to the Chabaco Hill development. So that whole section of the bylaw would be deemed satisfied with the SP1.
Right, but
And-
SB2 is, I mean, there's no differentiation, so as a developer, I'm
There
going, well,
isn't-
I'm going for SB2, because it's
Okay.
exactly the same.
Well, there's
No,
not.
it hasn't been defined yet, that's the
Because-
problem.
well, see,
We're
but
just
it's-
getting into the
No,
information.
no, no, I get it, I get it, I get
Let
it.
me just finish though,
Yeah,
Rick,
yeah.
because the SP1 becomes an as-of-right on the details and the form format. And that's where you're gonna start to see a differentiation. That one is easier, and again, it's the thing about doing a code in this manner, is that you can control all these things and make it as flexible or as tight as you want to
Well,
make
and
it.
there's the problem. That's the problem, is discretion. And that's where we fall down. We have a reputation of being extremely anti-developer in this town. They don't want to come to town.
But it's
So
all
we
related
need-
to the illustrative plan. If this board were to approve the illustrative plan, that becomes the model to streamline everything, not discretionary.
Let me give
So-
a really specific example. Zoning says, here's your property edge, stay at least this far away, but you can be a mile away, and it's all good. Now you gotta have a great big discussion, is a mile away good, is a half a mile away? No. In the modified or the hybrid form-based code, it says, you need to stay this close. You need to stay close to the street, so that you
Yeah, no,
hold
I
that
read- I
street.
read it. I
You
read it.
follow, yeah, so you follow that number, done, end of discussion. Check. End of
It's all
discussion.
as of right.
Oh,
then
it-
it-
that-
As of right.
And
okay.
lots are as
So,
of
and
right.
you can just keep following that through. So that's just an example.
I get it, you're the authors of this, so you understand what you intend.
Yeah.
But
It'll be in the charts.
I spent 2 hours with that chart. I was very confused. So I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I want, and especially for the public, they want to know what it is. So this is a political document. It's not only a planning document, it's a political document. So if I were reading this with a minimal amount of interest and experience and not on the planning board, I'd go, well, this is all kind of like, doesn't give me the clarity or specificity or protection as a voter that I would like. And that's why I asked if John Whitten could either say, this is great, and it fits within the form-based illustrative plan, or it doesn't. Or you could add these components to make it more clear in terms of the difference between the two processes. That's what I'm looking for. Because this right here, my experience is, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and
How are
more
you-
development is needed,
how are-
absolutely.
How is the planning board going to interpret this? Because it's very subjective. So.
It won't be subjective when it's filled, when the information filled out. And I agree, John Whitten would be great to look at it and give us feedback. Developers would be great to give us feedback. But right now, the fill in the blanks haven't been filled in. When you fill in the
Right,
blanks,
that's what I'm suggesting
Right.
is, we need to.
we could take a pass at filling in the blanks, then pass it around. So,
For SP1 and SP2.
yes.
Okay, so that's just my opinion in terms of this, what we might be working on. Others,
Well, that's the thing I said at the very beginning. I recognize that in rereading this, there really does need to be much more clarity, differentiating the two.
Right.
And having it be really clear what standards apply to the illustrative plans and what standards
good,
apply to the
good, okay.
concept plans.
We're there.
So when you read through this, you saw to be determined or placeholder. Right. Because, it was the idea that I wanted to have in everyone's mind, not the specific language, just so you know. So when you see placeholder, that's not necessarily definitive as to what it should be. It's just we don't want to forget that that's a concept that should be as a part of the outline.
We understood that, and I think that was very clear. And I think if that's your track one, that you're gonna keep those refinements going, that's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Track two is, I assume, what we're gonna bring to you on the 11th? Is that track two?
Absolutely. That's track two.
I think that makes
So I
sense.
would like to continue with our draft overlay district, and maybe I can speak with John Witten later in the week at his convenience and see how we can really fix what I like to call boilerplate, get that nailed down, but we need to incorporate all the information that Emil and Jonathan have provided. So at this point, we have about 45 minutes, and I'd like Jonathan to present the latest iterations with respect to the form-based approach. And again, I encourage you, Dr. Barnes, to really, and everyone else in the audience, to kind of study up on the form-based approach and understand that while it may be new to Hamilton, it's not new to Massachusetts, and it really does have significant potential benefits. And to Bill's point, we will find out the truth of that when commercial broker developers take a look at what we're
Madam Chair,
contemplating here.
before we proceed, two things. First of all, Bill Wheaton, in a sense, had the beginnings of a motion on the table, and I think it still pertains to, we're on a tight time deadline for town meeting, and basically it says we're pausing that.
Bill, could I ask you, could we defer that motion to our next meeting on July 11th?
Sure.
Because then I think we'd have a better understanding.
Think about it. Mull it over.
Well, think about it and see what the seminary produces, so if it's possible, we may be able to meld the two approaches.
Right.
It might be that there's some benefit to seeing what they've come up with, and so if we, just be sure to remember to bring it up.
Oh, I won't forget.
Perfect. That was the closure I was looking for. And then the second thing is Emil will be making a presentation, not me.
Oh, okay, did I say, I'm sorry.
So, just,
I was waiting.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I apologize. Not only do I not speak loudly, I'm jet lagged.
so you had earlier asked if John Witten had any comments,
I did.
but we haven't allowed him to make any comments, so can we get those before we?
Yeah, he should.
Absolutely, he should
Yeah.
speak.
Good afternoon or good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board. I do have comments, but respectfully, I think given the discussion that the board's just had with the seminary, I wonder if I shouldn't hold off. Because my comments really get into the weeds of the bylaw, and I think that's what the chair was saying earlier. It's a complex bylaw. I think it works really well. I don't think there is as much gradation between the special permit one, as I think the board's been referring to it, and the more aggressive special permit, the kind of more on the special permit heavy side. So if a one is closer to by right, a two really should be much more distinct from a one. And I don't think the way the draft is written now, it quite has that distinction. But I think that's really a matter of drafting. But that's the matter of drafting for a project that the board is either trying to embrace or invite. And that's kind of why I go back to what I just said. I think commenting on the details of the bylaw now is premature. I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to do it either now or by redlining the draft. But I would respectfully suggest maybe that's something that should wait. Because if the seminary is going to push back, and I think they should, so I was delighted to hear Dr. Barnes say that, I think the board and the public would benefit from a red line from the seminary. This is what we will tolerate. This is what we find unacceptable. And I think that will help shape the bylaw. But at this point, I don't think it's worth getting into the details of the bylaw if it's going to be revised further, especially if the seminary is really going to push back. And I think they should, to the extent that they have comments. I think we need to know what the seminary will find unacceptable. And if I could just say, Madam Chair, one more comment. All of this ties into the development agreement approach or strategy, which is in the hands of the select board, but of course it relates to what the planning board's doing. The development agreement is designed to get agreements, commitments from the landowner as to typically what won't happen on the property. And at this point, I'm not sure we're able to articulate all the both land uses and structural uses that the public and the board doesn't want. And I urge the seminary to comment on the draft so we can then work towards a common solution on the bylaw, and that will lead to the development agreement drafting. We can't do the development agreement if we're worlds apart on the bylaw.
Thank you for that.
Marty, and maybe before Emil, I had three quick points.
Sure.
One is just a clarification on what flexibility as a benefit means for the bylaw, as in I guess in the view of a potential developer, whether that means flexibility in ease of permitting or use might be interesting to know, because if we focus the bylaw on allowing for various degrees of permitting, maybe it may mean something to a developer or it may not. And whether or not they might focus otherwise on available use as a potential benefit, that might be good feedback to get. Another point would be that in the red line and review of the bylaw, it'd also be, maybe continue and get more specific on what Jonathan's request might have been of the seminary, would be maybe a 5-year plan is in terms of potentially what the site might need to support in a community that's attending the college as residents, and also what the administrative capacity that's required to support that community would be on the campus. That would give a little bit of insight on maybe, what available capacity is left over for utilities and whatever else. And lastly, I think I had a couple, I hadn't got it in by the deadline, but just some building performance criteria maybe be written and considered as part of the bylaw as well as it relates to environmental sustainability. I had some suggestions maybe on, like, especially new development and, what some recommendations or it's hard to make that a requirement in a lot of cases, but certainly some recommendations on, what types of energy you consider for heating and cooling a building, the performance criteria for the building envelopes and things like that would be, as we look at
Yeah.
both, long-term sustainability of the site and essentially, especially relating to new development, maybe even considering the redevelopment of existing space and what you might ask for in building performance criteria, because that I don't think is addressed in the bylaw currently.
Good idea.
Yeah. And now, I don't know if it's appropriate for the public to chime in at this point, or whether or not they're going to wait until after Emil presents on the form-based approach to this. Is it to wait until after that, or is it now an appropriate time to?
Well, certainly, if anybody had any comments, just with respect to our general discussion, I do want to allow enough time for Emil to produce his presentation. But if anybody has anything germane to what we just spoke about, now's the time. Sure.
And if you could identify yourself and your address, please, just for the record.
Absolutely. I'm Valerie Peck. I'm at 37 Miles River Road. I'm a direct abutter to the seminary. And I understand the two-track process that's being proposed. And I do think it's important that we get the input from the seminary. I do want to say, from a perspective of an abutter and a member of the town, that I truly appreciate the effort that's being put in by the planning board. And it's, even though it's not ideal in some ways, it's ideal in others, but just the certainty means something. So to totally disregard that and just go to something from scratch, I don't think, I prefer the red line approach to what is existing, and that gives us certainty in, from an abutter standpoint. So I I think we need to get the input, but I don't want to discard all the work and time that's been put into what's on the table before us. So
I think you can be assured that we're not.
that sense, but I think it's important to hear from people who are directly involved on a
No,
number of fronts.
that's
No,
good. That's good.
I appreciate that, but I would hate to throw out all
We're not
the
throwing the
hard work.
baby out with the bathwater. Anybody else? Good, bad, or indifferent?
Dave Dashkin, 215 Woodbury Street. We keep on, I'm very concerned about the future of the private wastewater treatment facility, which is directly across the street. That is my view of the seminary. I see the nice approaches going in the either exit off of Bridge or Essex, and that's not my view. I can show you a picture of my view, which is my view of the place. 10 months out of the year, or excuse me, 8 months out of the year, unless there's foliage, it's a little bit buffered now. So my concern is we keep on skipping over. I mean, if this board is not responsible for that, who is? Because none of this that you're discussing is possible without a wastewater treatment plant. And that alone, people gleefully talk about expanding it at will. So I'm concerned. So I'm at a butter. I'd be happier. That's a bad term because I'm not happy, so I want to be happier. I would be less unhappy, let me put it that way. If, as part of the consideration of this group, move the wastewater treatment plant to the center of the campus, move it out of Zone 2, move it out of the wellhead protection area, do like Biolabs did. New England Biolabs, I went over to their property. You can actually go online and see a nice video of their wastewater treatment facility. They built it right next door to their main door, okay? They built it right next door to their historic building on site. They didn't build it on the periphery of the property. They built right there. It became a central to their development. To make it, my suggestion, move it to the center of the campus where you would probably retain property. I'm sorry, I'm referring to you as if you're the seminary. Move it to the center of the campus. It's at the same grade level as the current facility. So really, there's not much issue about moving it there, other than the cost of physically moving the plant. And make it the central part of this great development. And then if you want to expand it, then the abutters are the people on the property. And I think that's a reasonable request. I think you should look into it. Just like New England Biolabs has it in the center of their property. Make it, the greenhouse associated with it, make that, part of the community. People can walk through it, look at the pretty plants. So that was my suggestion.
Anyone else? Okay, Emil, I think in the interest of time.
One other suggestion. Somebody's talking about capacity. Since it's not clear what they would like to retain of the existing apartment buildings alike, we ought to find out how many bedrooms, bedroom are in each unit for each of the floors in each of the buildings. That seems like a reasonable request. I'm sure they can do it. I'm sure I'm sure they have floor plans. I can read the floor plans for each of the floors. Let's establish that. So we have some idea, if they retain these buildings, how many bedrooms that mean.
322 bedrooms in those apartments.
I don't want the gross, I want how many units of each, like,
How many
how
one,
many
how many
three-bedroom
two?
apartments, how many two-bedroom apartments. In each of the units, because if you retain each, a certain number of units or certain buildings for your use, it'd be like to know what's left for the town.
Okay, Emil.
Emil, is this follow this?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, this incorporates the literature that you received in the
Okay.
mail or in your packet. I'm going to be as brief as I can on this PowerPoint again. But the content, we want to talk about the planned districts again. And these are sort of upgrades on some of the information we've seen before. Allowable uses, build-out options, build-out data. And then what I'd like to start then is what we are considering as the organizing principle of the site, which is building types. And all of that, the standards that follow that. And then there's some picture analogs at the end. This, many of you have seen this before. This was the district map, or the Browns Hill Overlay District map that we're using. Again, there are 8 different zones or districts within that, and each has their own regulatory system. The use chart here was upgraded a little bit, and there are some, as Dr. Barnes said, we did add some existing occupancies, reuse of existing occupancies that, by right, they would include the Kerr Hall, Library, Academic Center, and Chapel, the Retreat, Pilgrim Hall, Gatehouse, Wastewater Treatment Facility, and dormitories by right. So the use would continue in the same size that they are now. Any repurposing of that would then change things. If the buildings were repurposed for another reason, that would be a change. There's one item that came to light, and that is the down under industry and processing, limited light industry. That's one I think we want to look at again. I've heard some comments on that one, whether that should be there or not. So that was something. Rick said when we first looked at that this is a first pass really at the uses, and at some point we should come back and just redo this chart, not change it necessarily, but to re-examine some of the assumptions that we used in the beginning.
Emil, just a point on the wastewater treatment facility on that. It's a state-governed permit, so I'm not sure we have authority to weigh in on the use,
Yeah,
given that is a,
that yeah,
it's not a,
that's
it's
sort
not
of
a
an
town
exception,
permit,
yeah.
it's a state permit.
It's kind of an exception of.
It's really just to acknowledge that there has to be a building there, that's all.
Yeah,
So if the
just-
type of building,
yeah.
Yeah, we can't control the type of building, it just acknowledges there has to be a building,
understood.
that's all.
Yeah.
But since you raised the question, or did we just throw up our hands? I mean, like I said, the only reason to do any of this development is because of wastewater treatment facility. So whose responsibility is that? You're just gonna say, oh, the town can do, the state says you can do whatever the state wants, and nobody inquires, there's no inquiry about that? I don't understand.
Well,
Pat, do you-
it's the
Is it
Board of Health.
Yeah.
It's the Board
Pat,
of.
maybe you can comment on that.
Only in that it's a, again, it's a groundwater discharge permit that's governed by the state of Massachusetts, and the Board of Health is the agent in the town that gets the results every month. You have access to it as well, if you want
And
to.
I've seen this, so,
Yeah.
having the company that's operating the facility do the measurements and provide those to the town as a courtesy, it's not meant to.
It's a mandatory requirement.
That's not what I asked, that's not meaningful. I mean, relative to doing anything with the property, there's responsibility for whoever who owns and operates that facility to actually have the wherewithal to finance any kind of emergency action to make that facility work. There's a long litany of law that's required somebody operating a wastewater treatment facility. So there's no discussion of if they sell off a piece of the property for the existing dormitories, how are they gonna divvy out, who owns the wastewater treatment plant for each of these little cut-ups and the like? Who's gonna own it?
Sir, my understanding is, and this is from David Smith on the Board of Health, that there can be only one operator of the septic system, so there would have to be some type of condominium association among any property owners on the site, so there can be just one operator. The Board of Health does get the reports, but it's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that actually oversees these septic systems. And the way that the septic system would be addressed is through the development agreement. The actual zoning bylaw can't really address that, other than to say that to get a special permit, one would have to demonstrate that the septic capacity would be sufficient for the intended use. But to actually enforce it, and that would be the Commonwealth, but the development agreement itself could dictate how all those concerns with the septic system would be addressed if there was expansion. And I that's the extent that I can speak to it. I know John Whitten could speak to it more. But the development agreement is different than the zoning overlay district, but that would be where the town could require that septic capacity was sufficient for the intensity of development on the site.
But I think what the issue here is the location of it. And I think the location of it might actually be within the purview of the, illustrative plan, concept plan, or the bylaw, or certainly in negotiations with the developer, rather than putting if you had land that was equivalently usable, rather than, putting it at the edges where it impacts all the abutters, putting it more in the center of the development. I mean, that's something we could discuss and debate with the
Well, that's
developer.
I support a discussion of that, but Madam Chair, I'd like to promote that questions be held to the end.
Right, yeah,
Okay,
but I
so,
would
but
just,
I support that as a discussion, a fuller discussion. There's lots to be said on it. I don't think now's the time.
yeah, but it is part of the development agreement.
Rat hole.
Infrastructure is the development agreement. Go ahead.
Rick, could you kill the lights on the
Say
end of
again?
the room? Could you kill the lights on the end of the room here?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Not that end, the other end.
No, wrong one.
Thank you.
Oh, that helps.
Again, this is a chart you've seen before. On the left-hand, 3 columns, consultants. These are results that were tabulated by Abramson and Associates and David Gamble coming together. And this was the build-out that the options they were looking at. The color coding is that the darker blue color is highly likely. These are the dormitory buildings, essentially. The lighter blue color is a possible activity, that use that could be developed there, and the green is the most likely. And then the reddish orange highlighting life science, for example, would be a user-driven. So that would be the probably least likely at this stage. So this was the kind of the key information that we had gleaned from the consultants. Then it became a matter of determining what was the build-out intensity. So we took a look at, initially we introduced a low, medium, and high intensity. If you look in the planning board on the right-hand 5 columns, you'll see the first 2 are medium and high. We put the low intensity aside. That was all duplex housing. And then we created a Plan A and Plan B at the last meeting, and then since that, we looked at a Plan C1 and C2. So we're trying to refine this in a way to accommodate the best scenario that we can see taking place here. So this data, I won't go through it in a lot of detail. There's more later on in this presentation. But the bottom line, annual fiscal benefit, this was a tally by the consultants on what they anticipated if you were to build it out in this fashion, what the town would benefit on an annual basis. The planning board didn't have access to that key information, but we derived our estimates, these are all plus or minus, using similar types of multipliers that the consultants used. So just briefly, the medium intensity, this was a layout. The top part is the central campus part, the central district, and it was a combination of row houses, multiplex houses, and so forth. The bottom drawing introduced a senior serviced facility there, roughly 50,000 square feet, 25,000 square foot footprint, and other multiplex houses. And then the townhouses were placed in front of Pilgrim Hall there, and they're sort of they're a combination courtyard houses plus townhouses, because they have an open, traffic-free zone between right on the axis of the Pilgrim Building, going north. So there is a green space between the two, so it's like a courtyard complex with garages in the back. Again, you've seen these drawings before, so we're just going over the options. The Plan A, which was introduced last time, we looked at the top of the hill. Bridge Street is on the right, and then Woodbury on the bottom of the sheet, and then Essex on the left-hand side of that drawing. So at the top of the hill is the 46 or so 55-plus duplex housing complex. Again, it was similar to what we had talked about at another facility in Wenham. And the bottom was, again, more duplex. So this, we figured out the build-out on this, all the quantities. Plan B was substituting a senior serviced housing development for some of the duplex in the central district down at the bottom. Again, this is what we'd introduced at the last meeting. The top of the hill, we saw that, again, what the consultants had come up with was additions to Kerr Hall and possibly to the chapel and the library and so forth, either going up or whatever. We had put a 100-foot buffer along the property that abuts Bridge Street, and at the top of the hill, just anticipating that any future building should stay away from that edge because of the potential exposure of any new buildings up there at the top. There are 4 large water tanks that are buried in the central part of that. That's a green space, and nice vantage points from that area as well, both toward the east and the west. The other option on the top that we had looked at was residential. Again, this is same location, different configuration. This is duplex, roughly 2,600 square feet per unit. An idea that was discussed here, and then maybe reusing one of the buildings there on the site because of the location of it, that blue building right in the center there, would be useful there as that actually is the original entry into the chapel, I believe, up at the top of the hill. So it's kind of a neat building, nicely done, a piece of architecture, so that if we could perhaps use that, that would be very good. So that's the building right there. Plan C1, this represents a slight change. C1 is a drawing that keeps the duplex housing at the top of the hill, as you see it right there. But what we did was go back to a medium intensity level development down here with a town green, and then the dormitories highlighted here with the laser pointer, and other multiplex buildings. So this is to kind of create, trying to integrate those 3-story dormitories into more of a development there. Again, looking at kind of holistically at this site, what would be a balance on this site that preserves all of the preferences, including the open space here, which is the heritage landscape. What's a holistic development that incorporates variety of housing perhaps that's not used here in town? It's sort of it's a new old idea of what they refer to as missing middle housing that used to be pre-World War II housing that was done where you get actually multiplex units the size of sort of mansions or mansion houses or large houses, so it kind of integrates nicely into a residential community, but it has it's a more compact development in terms of the intensity, more dwelling units per acre. So that turned out to be, even though there looks like there are a few buildings, there are some significant dwelling units in this area. Each of the townhouses would be owned singly. The townhouses over here, there'd be 2 levels on that, roughly 3,000 square feet, which is a large townhouse. And as I said before, there's a green space between them right here that represents a public space on axis with Pilgrim Hall, and a facility here which could either be a community building right here, or it could be additional townhouses to be decided. And then C2, which is, again, would use the the more commercial top of the hill development here with additions to Kerr Hall perhaps, or the chapel, or take all the buildings down and put a commercial setting up there of some size. And then down at the central part, you'd have the congregate housing or the senior serviced living facility there, similar to the Riverbend project. In the central part, replacing the multiplex houses in the town green area. In all cases, the townhouse development at the Pilgrim Hall would remain the same. This is a lot of numbers, but this is kind of the breakdown. We went through the math on all of this to figure out, well, what does this all translate in terms of dwelling units, in terms of square footage, for the purpose of arriving at I don't want to say at an intensity, not a density, but an intensity of development on the site. And the bottom summary graph right here is the one that has all of the data in terms of how many dwelling units. The yellow column on the right-hand side gives you the totals for this, for each of the 5 scenarios or 6 scenarios. So from medium intensity, it's 68 dwelling units, 151 square feet. So we're now starting to get a sense of how much building, if we were to use these illustrative plans, how much they would actually contribute, to the project. Again, we can talk about any of these figures later, but just make a note that the dormitories are not included in this, and buildings like the Retreat House are not included in this, and the Pilgrim Hall is not included in this. So these are basically new construction on the site and do not include any of the dormitories or existing buildings. So this is the breakdown, as I say, for the south, the Stables area, the central, the north, acreage, and so forth, with all the totals on the right-hand side. What you'll notice is that the numbers don't differ that much in square footage. They're all in the 150 to 160 range. The dwelling units are boosted, like the 126 numbers are boosted by the presence of senior serviced housing, which is really 80 beds that would take place there. So again, that would be, the others are all multiplex building housing units or duplex houses. This is a time where now we would get into the organizing principle, and the thought was here that we would use building types as the organizing principle. And by that, I mean, every time you write a code, especially a code that where form is the presence, is the important part of that consideration, only because it's the most meaningful and long-term. Buildings can be changed in ownership, uses can change in buildings, but what generally stays is the form on the site. This is one of the interesting parts of the organization of this. Now, typically, when you do a form-based type code, you can use either street types as your organizing principle, and that is organize everything around particular streets. If you have commercial streets or residential streets or civic streets, they would be the organizing principle. Or you could use frontages. They could be storefronts. They could be residential porches. They could be whatever. Frontages is another way. And you can do location. Location would be using something like the transect, which we talked briefly about a long time ago, which is a location on a continuum of rural to urban in terms of its configuration and complexity. So for a site like this, which is relatively simple and very small, even though it is 100 acres, the building type seems to be the one that protects the neighborhood character the best, and so that's the one we wanted to be sure to use. So typical building types that we've now placed in each of the districts are detached house, duplex, attached house, triplex, quadplex, townhouses, multifamily, live, work, business, commercial, and accessory. These are houses that were approved in the use categories. So these are potential housing types that could be built in one of the districts. So what typically happens then is that you can determine lot sizes. These are lot standards. This is just a rough graph or a matrix of lot sizes, where a large house lot at the top, you would start to refine and define what the lot widths are and sizes and so forth. So you can start to test some of these illustrative plans, which is actually our next step. What we would do is take the illustrative plan, and they were worked out when they were initially developed using sort of accepted standards for particular performance and particular types of construction, either more like a town center, a more compact development, or more spacious areas, more like single-family housing. But this would be the list of lots that would be incorporated in the code. And we started to fill that in, but the numbers are not important at this stage. This is just the way to organize the whole code. So these are allowable form standards. Now, on the top of the sheet there, and across the top row, you would see Browns Hill. You have the North Residential. You have the Central Residential Commercial, and then you have the Stables Residential Commercial. Those are the four principal ones that would see the most activity in terms of construction, because of their location, because of they're all contiguous in a way. So what we would use is, if you look at the list on the right, use the following standards: a residential density, building placement, lot and block standards, building heights, parking locations, allowed frontages, and encroachments. So these are standards, and some of which are in our codes right now. Building placement, for example, there are setback requirements in most of the bylaws that the town currently uses. There are building heights that are used, some even parking locations. So this is really kind of an extension of that, using similar but more detailed, because these are the ones that more fully define the public spaces that are in front of all the houses. And that's why it's critical that we're making judgments here, not just on the housings and in terms of their sizes, but also on the public realm, which is the streets, the sidewalks, the street trees, and so forth. Getting all of those being considered at the same time, so they all function as a unity. They all work together to create a street wall. Anytime you have a development area, whatever part of town you want to go to, if you go down Railroad Street, for example, the street wall is actually the buildings that oppose each other on the opposite sides of the house, of the main road, railroad. And it forms a wall, it forms an enclosure. So that is the way you start to define what a space not only is, but what the behavior is that happens inside those areas. So what we did here was start to take these, and again, the numbers, I don't want to debate these right now, but we will down the line. But look at front build to line here, or setback, front street frontage build out. All of this stuff matters because it kind of pinpoints where a lot of that activity must happen to get a particular result. And this result would be a neighborhood of a particular density and a particular configuration. So here you have the lock and block standards, building heights, and so forth. Next slide has the South District, which is just the dormitories, A and B. Heritage landscape, utilities expansion, and the natural areas. Again, the idea in this chart is somebody can glance at, the developer can glance at this and get a good idea of what can happen where, and what is the dimension to get it done, to do that. You then have, for each of the districts, there would be building form standards. And again, this is restating with the building placement, setbacks, frontage, lot and block standards, and so forth. So you have this breakdown here. The two sketches at the top really give you locations where these particular performance standards are. This A, for example, front build to line, is right here. It's between the street line and the build to line. So that is a matter of probably 0 to 12 feet, something like that, in the central part of the campus. So you have all of these setback locations that are identified here. You have all the vertical locations that are identified here and are filled in down here. So the main building height, for example, would be F, which is this height right there. So this is the place where that information is contained, it's organized, and it's really easy to read when you're studying and designing this part of the campus. And then you have parking and allowed encroachments. The parking on the left, the dark gray areas are the envelope on the site where the particular parking can occur. Now, there'll be a building on there too, but these are important dimensions to get parking, say, off the main street right here, so you're not looking at an automobile parked in a driveway like right here. So it just kind of cleans up the look on that. On the right-hand side, the encroachment line is this shaded line right here, the tan line, and the gray is the setback. And what an encroachment would be, it would include things like balconies, bay windows, awnings, galleries, stoops, and other frontage elements. So those can encroach on the front setback, and those would be in the order of something like 3 roughly to 6 feet to 12 feet would be the encroachment there. Then some notes, district-specific parking requirements and so forth.
Can I ask a question? So the zeros in there are just placeholders?
Yeah, they're placeholders. They have not been, they're not meant to be zero. They're just, that's where you would put a number.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, thank you. It took a couple of pictures. These are just analogs of what we're talking about. And there are interesting buildings around. This is Annisquam, not too far away from a street view. And this was looking at some older buildings that really are of a size that could accommodate, in this case, this could be like 4 units in here because of its size, but it's combined. This building a little bit further away, although built as a single-family house, typically that could, again, house at least a duplex. It could be a stacked duplex, one on top of the other. So this is what I mean, the idea of getting these multiplex houses, using them fairly close together without overdoing it, and where none of the buildings is any larger. They're all going to be smaller than the retreat house. They're all going to be smaller than any mansion in the area that you might typically find in that part of town. And yet, so they would be in character in terms of their size and roughly their appearance. Another street on River Road in Annisquam, a similar thing, just showing the importance, the way they used to put up buildings in close proximity to the street. Minor sidewalk here, and but again, there's no parking to be seen anywhere, no cars. There is parking on the street here, which we would propose to have parking on one side of the street, I think at the seminary site. A project I was familiar with in Connecticut, this was a project where these homes were combinations of single houses, duplex and triplex houses that were all combined. These are a little bit larger in scale. They're up around 3,000 to 4,000 square feet. But again, the concept of adjacent to the street, you have street trees, a lawn strip there, a sidewalk, and then set back to the main building. And this would be a beginning of an alley over here to go to your parking in the back of the building.
Is this applicable also to the Browns Hill, or is just the central campus?
This is the central campus.
55 and over?
This could be done at the top of the hill as well.
So as 55 and plus?
Yeah, 55. These are 55 and plus housing. They are, and there are 2 levels, upper and lower. Single family, it's not a stacked accommodation here. They're all like townhouses. They're like a vertical up and down. But it is 55 senior housing. Again, this would be a similar concept. And this is what's, again, kind of called the missing middle house. You just don't see this built anymore. What's happened with the real estate industry is that it's driven everything to either be single family or huge complexes of, very large apartment buildings. They've driven out the middle. And this is something that's coming back in this country, this idea, because it's not that it's nostalgic looking, but it has all the qualities of things that make it more walkable and enjoyable to be in. It's a space I think you could see yourself in, perhaps going for a walk down the street, and without any of the nuisances that you typically find with.
Two questions. So
Yeah.
the walkways like out front always accommodate two people walking side by side?
Yeah, they would have to. Yeah, they should be in the order of 5 feet. These are not. These are 4 feet, I think, in this complex.
And then, does snow removal addressing all this kind of stuff, when you have these small, narrow streets, and is that just left up to the private property owners?
Oh, snow removal? Yeah, these are all private property, so these are all private property in this particular complex.
Yeah, so I mean, so they're responsible. I mean, I've driven
Yes.
around Anna's Farm in the wintertime,
Yeah,
and I notice like,
yeah.
it's a disaster.
Yeah, these,
I'm just trying to understand, how, okay.
yeah, this, but you get it, and I'm not showing this for stylistic reasons, not saying this is the way it ought to look, because that's an imposition that we don't want to do, frankly. You can do this in many ways, but these are very, the important thing is here is again, the placement of the buildings, the relationship, in this case, of open space. Here you have a row of houses on the left that face this kind of long greenway. Again, this would be very similar to what we were looking at for the Pilgrim Hall. Houses opposing each other on opposite sides of a greenway, cars excluded, and parking would be in the back of the building, accessed by alleys. And this is an example of an alley here in the back. I just took the shot of the garages here. They're completely out of sight from the main front, actually from all of the streets. This is a rare occasion when you can actually see a garage, because typically they're off alleys. This is the alley right here in the back of the house, so they're really off the. And then this is the last shot. Again, another good example of a composition where everything was thought out on this. It looks like it just happened, but things don't just happen. You really do have to plan them. You have to plan for everything on that. So if you think a lot of this detail is sort of, well, it's a lot of minutia, it's not really important, it all is important. And once you get it in place, it's codified, it is there, and it's easy to read. And developers like it because it's certainty for them, and that's the thing that they like. They can see, they know if they build it 12 feet with a setback on the building 12 feet, that's the way it's going to be approved. They like it because of the certainty. And towns like to use these form-based codes because of the certainty and the predictability. You can tell what it's going to look like in advance. And that means a lot to a lot of people, and it certainly does for developers. So I think this is one of the reasons that, as difficult and time-consuming as this is to put together now, I think it has long-term benefits if the town were to use this going forward. So that's it. Again, a lot of information you may have seen before, or maybe some of you have not, but that's kind of a recap and an update of where we are on this, now starting to introduce the level of detail that is really the stuff that's going to make it happen, and happen in a way that will be really beneficial. And it all will comport or follow the illustrative plan. So if you want to know what it's going to look like, there's your site plan right there. I know, Jonathan, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate something that you said, but just put a finer point on it, which is it's organized by building type, but building type, it's easy to get confused. Building type isn't the style of the building, it isn't the period of the building, it's none of those things. It's the position of the building in relation to the street, the density of the buildings in relationship to the street, and the position of open space in relationship to the buildings. That's what this is about. So scale of the building and its position, rather than the style of the building. That's very, very important.
It really is a system where everything works together, and that's when you get the result that you're really looking for. And I mean, this is stuff that a site designer would know and they sort of would use, but you wouldn't necessarily know that. But what you do know when you see it is that that's not, that's really, that does what we had hoped it would do, in terms of being walkable and attractive. And
So for example, when you looked at those pictures, none of those buildings were far back from the street, sort of floating in space with a great big yard around them. They were all close to the street,
Right.
for Central Campus, close to the street, and then the open space is combined into something that's more for the community or those residents,
They're really civic spaces that are used for gathering, for whatever.
rather than large yards around each building. That's the difference here.
Yeah.
That's what controls the sprawl
Yeah.
and preserves the larger open space for the residents and the greater community.
Mhm. Right, thank you.
So in those situations, are these like condos in the sense that the property and the exteriors, are those all in control of the overall association or something like that? as
The
opposed to-
particular pictures I showed you, yes,
an
they,
example, or at least as represented by the examples you gave.
correct, they were condominiums, and they were, the condominiums were owned by the owners, but the site was really operated by, whether it's the association or the owner of the site, I'm not sure who did it. I wasn't involved in that, but I was very familiar with that site.
Exteriors are like the responsibility of the association. As
Yeah.
opposed to, and the walkways and all that.
Yeah, my guess is that each house owner probably has control of the landscaping around their particular portion, maybe, but not in terms of landscaping the entire site, or, I think they had that was built and designed and for the entire site, not for individual use, but. But as Jonathan pointed out, if you were to see a subdivision, everything is private property. You can't walk anywhere you want to walk. Whereas projects like that, and what we're anticipating, we'd like to see at the seminary, would be open space. You could walk in this landscape, this heritage landscape that you see on the screen freely, and because it is a civic space, it is a park that we'd like to preserve. Because when you get that many people on the site, it just relieves, it gives them a place to go away from their house and just for a walk and so forth. So again, the idea here is to not just build square footage on the site, but to do it in a way that's really effective, in a meaningful way, as a walkable community, livable and very attractive, something that has its own identity. It's different from other things you're going to see in town, and yet it isn't different in a lot of ways. It's similar, but it's better. It's a place. It's not just a collection of buildings. We saw some buildings proposed, by the consultants, where they would just put sort of like wallpaper across the ground of duplex houses, each one equally spaced from the other, and it gets monotonous. It just is. It's kind of mind-boggling why you would even do that, but, there you go. So, yes, ma'am.
I just have a general question,
Yeah.
maybe we could work through this in the draft that you're working on. I can see how this kind of a form-based concept would work with different residential sectors. How would that interface with something like, a river view? Is that what it is, river view?
Riverbend.
Riverbend.
Or something like that, I mean, how would there be some consistency? I mean, were I a buyer, okay, I might like the concept of the condominium, but
Yeah.
then, behind me would be something that might not fit in. I mean, when
Well,
you take that
yeah,
first
it's
step out,
Yeah.
there's a neighborhood around this property
Yeah.
that's very different from what you're proposing.
Yeah, it's a great question. What we would have to be sure of, because there seemed to be a lot of interest in a senior-type living facility on the site in the conversation we heard from the consultants and so forth. So we wanted to be sure to include one, but one that sort of is of the right scale to work there. And if you were to look at the Riverbend project, what they had done there was they took all of the massing and they broke it up into individual blocks, put them in different colors so that they looked as though it was an assemblage of a group of buildings, different scale, different heights, different roof configuration. In other words, it looked like a complex there of individual buildings rather than a monolithic building. I think the worst thing to do, I think the thing that would bother you and bother me, would be a monolithic building there that,
Again, how would that be, how
Question is how to codify it.
Oh, well, that's why the details are important. That's why we would put that in the code. If this were a commercial building, this would be the requirement. And that's why we limited it to a 25,000 square foot footprint, because that would be a scale that would be sort of in keeping with, it's one that was nearby so people could actually picture it and visit it. But it's one that would also work in that situation. So you'd want to be sure that if you were to put that type of facility, it wouldn't be a massive building there on the site.
And the other thing is that the bylaw would have provisions regarding landscaping so that there could be appropriate screening and a way to make that larger building not seem so massive.
As we look at this and what's going to work, it's probably very important to get a clear idea when we talk about a commercial development, what that commercial means.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so in a previous presentation, we also mentioned that just as with residents at Riverbend, they cited that building in kind of nestled it in a bowl in the hillside, which reduced the mass. We've specifically placed the congregate housing in that same kind of bowl situation. So we're looking at that and thinking about that both in terms of where it's placed, what its maximum size is, and what its massing is. And yes, there's more work to be done on codifying that to make sure that it does fit in the character. But we are thinking about as many of those things as we possibly can.
It was also
You raise a very important question, though, which is that if you codify things carefully, and then you say it's by right, you can't really be sure. You're worried that you can't really be sure whether the as-built winds up with something that you like or not. They've met all the conditions in the code. On the other hand, if you have a development project in front of you that meets the code and it's a special permit, you can certainly say, well, you know, this building would really be much better if it was variegated and looked differently than this building and so on. And you can really work with the developer. And then finally, you have a set of elevations and plans that you stamp and you approve. So in some sense, it's much easier to get the outcome that you want when you have a developer in front of you and you have some control, like through a special permit process, as opposed to trying to lay out everything in advance and then saying, well, if you meet all these criteria, then it's by right. Because there's bound to be something you've overlooked in the,
Well-
in the code, whereas when you're looking at the plans, they are the plans and they will be built as planned.
Well,
I-
I understand what you're saying, but as I listen to all this and realize that the perimeter buildings that are now in not such very good condition, because I know people who lived in those apartments, those are by right, and they would be developed for all the number of units, you know, I would imagine with as much use of existing structure to make it economically feasible for some.
Oh, they would be kept pretty, I mean, the bedrooms might be rearranged, but
I'm saying, so how does that, you know, if you've got that, how does that fit in with something that looks wonderful? I'm just asking that, and I'm not trying, this is a big deal, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, particularly given the players and what their demands are, that all of us working together are aware of where those intersections are and how they could be potentially, I'll use the term managed. I don't have the answers, but I think there are issues that have to be considered.
Yeah, we would anticipate that those buildings might go, that they would be replaced.
the ones on the top or the apartments?
The apartments, like C and D maybe, or something like that. I haven't been in them. I don't know what the new developer is going to do on the site, but it's possible they could go. In which case, we would anticipate that they have to be addressed in terms of, again, that's why we divided the districts up in one way, where
That's another advantage in having a plan in front of you, right? Then you can say,
I-
you're keeping these and you're gonna modify them so they look like this and they fit in,
I-
or whatever you're doing.
I have to disagree. This is Bill's thought on that. I completely disagree. I think this is not the way to do it. It's trial and error, and it's a long process. But anyway, we haven't come to any kind of agreement on this, so. Yes, ma'am.
Elaborate slightly on what the overflow utility.
Utility expansion area.
Yeah, what does that mean?
That's a septic system.
But I mean, what,
treatment plant.
well, I understand, but I'm just saying, what, so that's an underground thing? Is that what that is?
Well, this particular one, and again, Pat can certainly address this much better than I could, but the idea here is that if you're going to increase the density on the site, the population, the facilities, chances are that facility has to be expanded in some way. To some,
What does that
What does
mean?
that
Because
Some-
we're going to be looking at it
yeah,
here.
That's above us, yeah. What is that? But what is that a structure? Is that an underground thing?
well, if you look again at the biolab facility there, it's actually quite an attractive greenhouse that they have there, and it's, what that thing accommodates is just amazing in terms of usage. You know, the quantity of wastewater.
That's right.
And it's,
Drinking water, yeah, got that. No, but I mean,
I missed that.
but just,
Yeah, and I know we're talking about protecting the, you know, what it looks like inside, you know, but you're bringing it, you know, in all of these, and I know we can't talk about it today, but I'm just gonna bring it up really briefly, because in all of your schematics, all of your drawings, you have a new road coming out to Woodbury, and you're bringing it right to my front door, literally right to my front door, so you're focused on these people that don't even live here yet, and not about your own residents that are here. So every night I'll see headlights in my window and all
I'll
this traffic. I mean, it's
I'll let,
ridiculous. I mean,
Jonathan, you can answer that.
Okay, so we're not predicating that they have to have an additional road, but if a traffic study requires additional roads, or if fire safety or emergency access safety analysis, which is not the planning board's purview, if they say, with this site, you need additional access for safety or traffic safety or emergency safety, we need to just make sure that we've thought of where that could be. There are a limited number of places where that could be. Again, we're not predicating that it be there, but if it needs to be somewhere, in all likelihood, it needs to be someplace where there are reasonable sight lines, where they're not steep hills, where it's not going through a wetland, and where it's not going through an existing building. So there are very limited places for that. So what we did is we showed that as a placeholder. It's not dictated. It's not predicated on that. But if it were required, it is a location that so far, on first blush, meets all those requirements. Then what we've done in addition to that is if it was required to go in, and if it went there, what we've shown it to have is, number one, it has a curved road alignment. It's not straight. It's also surrounded by vegetation, which would be in the bylaw, that it has to be vegetated, so that.
But you have headlights.
Let me just finish. So let me just finish, if I could. Yes. So that if it were there, first of all, it could be an emergency access only point. In other words, it could be gated. There's many situations like that where, let's say it's required for emergency access, it's gated, so therefore there are no headlights unless there's a fire emergency. But if it was required by a traffic study, it could be one way in. It could be, there's many different permutations that this could take on. If for some reason it was required to be two-way or come out, what we would want to dictate is that it had the least disruption to that neighborhood as possible. And the way to do that is to bend the road and to put vegetation on each side so that if a car were to drive out, it is the headlights are shielded until it gets to the stop point, and then it's between properties rather than aiming at a property. And if you look at it, it's very carefully sited to do that. So we looked at We looked at literally every location. If we were required, again, we're not proposing that that be there, but if it were required, what would be the least disruptive to all parties? That was the analysis. And that's about as much as we can do in preparation. If we didn't do anything, that road could go anywhere and we wouldn't have any control over it. So that's the thinking that went through it. So,
One more thing.
sure.
Woodbury Street, regardless of whose house has to deal with the headlights, and we deal with the headlights of whoever's emptying the septic in the middle of the night all the time. Woodbury Street is very narrow. It is not a two-way street.
Again, it wouldn't be the board's, it wouldn't be the board's prerogative to say that street has to be there or not. That would be a traffic engineer
There are
and
other,
safety.
there are other options, like you might be able to expand the exit on Bridge Street to be both ways. But again, that's not our purview. We would look at what the traffic engineering alternatives were and then try and make some recommendations.
Right.
I guess, but is there a benefit of showing it where it is on the illustrative plans at all? Like,
No.
would there be any detriment to removing it and letting the civil engineering group propose what's required based on the level of the development? That's, there's no benefit really in having it there at
Well,
the
you
moment.
could turn what I just said into words.
Yeah.
In other words, you could say if, and I'd be happy to do this. We could say, it'd be a lot more words than a picture. We could say, if it is required, it must do all the things that I just said.
And I hear you, I hear what you're saying, and it all makes sense, coming out, even in the diagram, but the reality could be very different, and there's been lots of situations where the reality turns out to be very different than the schematic and all of the other regulations, and
We would endeavor to control it, and we could,
Yeah, just take it out.
so we can take it out. If,
So I think before we get into an argument about this, I understand it's very personal and very emotional. That's what a special permit process is all about. It's a public process. So as a design is proposed, the public will be there to opine on what it thinks about that. I think you can take away from this that there's been very careful consideration of this proposal. Don't shake your head no, because we spent thousands of hours. That's just the beginning. It lays the base down. Then if there's a proposal, and as Jonathan said, if it's a requirement. So don't jump to conclusions that it's a done deal. It's not there yet. And it won't be there until there's a public hearing, until there's a project, until there's a hearing where you get to hear what's being proposed and how it might impact you.
so
The town has proposed in those drawings, so.
No, you're not listening. You're not listening.
I hear you fine.
No,
It's still hypothetical.
It's hypothetical.
That's the point.
So take it out, and certainly widen the access to Bridge Street. Come on,
Well,
there's
then-
no reason for that to be one way at all.
So the issue with the access to Bridge Street is that it's a steep hill.
Compared to
So,
Hall Street.
so the access to Bridge Street is a steep hill. It would need to be widened, straightened, and regraded. So there would be significant amount of tree removal to do it,
I'm not
which
concerned.
which you might not be concerned about. A traffic engineer might be concerned about it, or another abutter might be concerned about it. So all those things would have to be looked at very carefully. So you do an alternatives analysis. What's involved in widening, straightening, realigning, removing trees on the Bridge Street access? What's involved in putting 4 lanes off of Essex Street? What's involved in putting a curb cut somewhere we haven't thought of yet? That would all go into the thinking. That's all.
Well,
And that would be a public hearing.
ladies and gentlemen, it's 9:20. I think we've covered as much as we can tonight, and unless there are any more questions, we do understand your concerns, and at this juncture, you have to remember, we haven't finalized anything. We're still hearing from everyone, and so just be patient with us. We're doing our best to really address all the abutters' concerns as well as other constituencies. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn the planning board
Second.
meeting.
So when I call your name, will you please indicate whether you assent to the motion? Pat Norton?
I would love to say aye, but I do see a hand up in the audience.
Did someone have a final? No?
Okay, if I allow them to talk briefly.
Who has a hand up?
Elizabeth,
Call in.
Oh, I
Bill?
apologize. I
is that your relative? It's been asked to unmute. Is it Elizabeth? We I don't know how long the hand has been up for.
Is it down now?
Oh, she's there again. Asked to unmute.
She's on mute, so.
Elizabeth, you're on mute.
So she needs to unmute herself.
She needs to unmute herself. Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Sorry, mistake. I was carrying the laptop around the house.
Oh, so you don't have a
I have no question.
Oh, sorry. All right.
Oh,
False alarm.
Okay.
Pocket call,
So I could say you.
you can say
I
aye.
could say aye. Yeah, okay, aye.
pocket call.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Weeden, aye.
Emil
Emil
Dahlquist,
Dahlquist, aye.
Beth Herr,
Beth Hart, aye.
Rick Mitchell,
Aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good evening.